Paul was in the book of Acts, and Paul gets an opportunity to have his own debate before he writes all this good advice on how to deal with debates. And this isn't just a personal disagreement. This is a church debate. This is the whole church deciding what they stand for and how they should fight for their understanding of God. And so he doesn't really follow his advice. This is what he says. We're going to read this through little by little from Acts 15. So if you're following along, some of you, that middle pew over there brings their Bible. So if you want to follow along, you'll just bounce a little bit. 15, 1 and 2. While Paul and Barnabas were at Antioch in Syria, that's a town kind of up to the north of the biblical land, some men from Judea, that's kind of down south below Jerusalem, they arrived and began to teach the believers, unless you are circumcised as required by the law of Moses, you cannot be saved. If there are any kids in here who don't know what circumcision is, then no, we're good. We're good on that. Good. So, Paul and Barnabas disagreed. They disagreed with him. And they argued vehemently. Finally, the church was probably annoyed by the argument, because churches get annoyed by arguments. The church decided to send Paul and Barnabas down to Jerusalem, down south, accompanied by some local believers, to talk to the apostles and elders about this question. And when they arrived in Jerusalem, Barnabas and Paul were welcomed by the whole church, including the apostles and the elders. They reported everything that God had done through them. But then some of the believers who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees. You've heard that word Pharisees. Well, this is the group of people who have been Pharisees and now they're following Jesus. So this is their spiritual lineage. I think it was Justine's thing said spiritual lineage or spiritual predecessors or something. So these are just people who came out of the Pharisees and now they're kind of following Jesus. So the sect of the Pharisees, they stood up and they insisted the non-Jewish converts must be circumcised and required to follow the law of Moses. So here we are, full debate. One side says that all the new people who are coming to become Christians must have this thing done, which is their way of saying they have to become Jews first, because obviously that's the tradition. Obviously there are traditions you have to follow. And the other side says, why put a burden in front of people who want to come to God? Why would you do that? So this is obviously a religious issue. It also is a political issue, since Jews held a certain standing in the Roman authority. I mean, we have, a lot of churches have tax breaks. So if there was questions about who belongs in a church, there's questions with political import. A lot of churches have a loud voice in culture. So who gets to have that voice? Political issue just as well. So the question is, are we going to start our own thing and try to get our own tax breaks? Or are we going to be alongside the Jews and be persecuted or preferentially treated, either way? Are we going to create our own identity or stay connected together? It's a religious question. It's a political question. It's a serious, painful question for the men involved. And when you get to those kind of questions, then and now, usually there's not much middle ground. There's a lot of empty space in our pews today. In this case, Paul and the Pharisee Christians and the Jerusalem leaders, they have to make a decision. And no one's getting out of the way. This is a real fight. No one's going to change anyone's mind. They are where they belong. And someone is going to win, and someone is going to lose. And someone's going to go home hurt and angry. Here's the next few verses. So the apostles and the elders, they met together to resolve this issue. And at the meeting, after a long discussion, Peter stood and addressed them. And Peter talks more than me, so we'll just skip most of his speech. So then everyone listened quietly as Barnabas and Paul told about the miraculous signs and wonders God had done through them among all the non-Jews. We don't actually hear in the text anyone speaking for the becoming Jewish side, but I'm sure they talked too. So when everyone had finished, James stood up. This is James, brother of Jesus, who's kind of in charge of the church. Early on in the movement, James gets to be in charge. Little brothers, I guess, always think they're in charge, but in this case it actually happens. So James stood up and said, "Brothers, listen to me." He talks a little bit, and then he gives his verdict. And his verdict goes like this. "And so my judgment is that we should not make it difficult for the non-Jews who are turning to God. But we should write and tell them to abstain from eating food offered to idols, and abstain from sexual immorality, and abstain from eating the meat of strangled animals, and from consuming blood. For these laws of Moses have been preached in Jewish synagogues in every city, on every Sabbath, for many generations." So what just happened there? What was that judgment about? What just happened is, it's not all that obvious, but James is in charge of the church. He understood that Peter and Paul are right. That side's right. Circumcision is just too much to ask. But the Christians who have been Pharisees, they're also right, because we don't give up our traditions. Some of our holy traditions are important there. So James decides, well, we're not going to do this, one side loses, but we can make some new converts do these other things that are very central to who we are. So two sides win, two sides lose. Things that we all agree are important, we're going to hold on to, but things that are too much of a burden to God, we're going to let go of. And so, in the face of controversy, compromise. It's the first decision that the church ever had to make. In the face of controversy, compromise. In the face of controversy where there seemed to be nothing but win or lose, the church found another way. And so with that, we've got 4 biblical models now for what to do when people in the church disagree. When it's a big issue for the whole body to decide, we find an emotional compromise, procedural compromise, theological compromise. We find a way that all people can follow God. And when it comes to personal issues that we have in the church between people, we can agree to disagree. We can kill them with kindness, or we can work on it until you just have to stop talking about that issue for a while. When it comes down to us, when it comes down to our day, to guns and gays and abortion and climate change and immigration and healthcare and taxes and all those fun things, we get to decide whether to follow those biblical models in order to provide peace and harmony for God's church. We can line up two sides that face each other and stare each other down as though we are in debate. Now in 1990, I guess it was February of 98, the Broncos won a Super Bowl. Does anyone remember watching that game? John Elway, Brett Favre, he spins it. John Elway jumps into the end zone, spins around, gets the touchdown. Really exciting game. I was in England at the time. And they don't care about American football. They still don't care about American football. They cared less then, but they were nice to us. And so for all the Americans, they set up a big screen TV late at night to watch the game in the Oxford Union. The Oxford Union is the oldest debating society in the world. So a week before, we were hanging out with Stephen Hawking. A week later, we're watching the Super Bowl. At some point in the night, I had Shakespeare's bust in my arm using it as a football. I was young, indiscretions. They had a lot of, Budweiser and hot dogs for £1. So, the game won. The Broncos won. It was exciting. But we were in this place that had been known for centuries and still is known as the place to debate. And the way they do it in Oxford is the seats are not quite as facing each other, but they're on two sides. And one person comes up and says, I believe in this position over here. And people move to that side. And this person comes up and says, I believe in this, and this is why it should be. And people move to that side. And they move to that side as the debate goes on. And you watch. The point of the debate is they start with how many people are on either side. The winner of the debate is how many move to the other side at the end of the debate. It's really a fascinating kind of thing to watch this happen. We would go sneak in there all the time and watch brilliant people debate. And you get up and you think, oh, well, that actually is a good idea. I hadn't thought of that. Moved over there. You want to try that? Start moving around the church? No, I'm not going to make... Ray, we won't run me out of town for that. We won't make you run around in the middle. Because in our regular life, we have plenty of opportunities to be on a side. And some of us, we hide from that. Some of us just have the personality. We don't like conflict. We hide from it. Others of us revel in the opportunity to tell someone who's right and who's wrong. Some of us are great at fighting. Some of us just can't figure out how to achieve disagreement in a peaceful way. But in this place, in this room, with these mixed up pews, with these people, this is a community. We are the people God calls together to find ways to live together and grow together and move together toward the world that God wants. Even when conflict happens, even when tension lands us in these places. Your family, your workplace, your old friends, your AA group, your teammates, it is a good thing. I am proud when we can find ways to respectfully disagree in the midst of controversy. But in the body of Christ, we are called to more. We are called to be diverse, called to grow through our process of working out difference, called to grow through our process of offering forgiveness and finding reconciliation. We are called to resist factions. We are called to trust each other, however sensitive the topic. We are called not to judge, but to try to do all those things that you heard from Paul. And see, the question today, if you've been here a few weeks, you know that each of these sermons is based on some questions from the new members. And the question today is, how has politics changed religion? Yeah, it's had an effect. I'm sure we have opinions about that. My thought is that politics affects religion all the time. Every time that a church sticks its head in the sand scared of an issue, every time the church takes a stand too hard and offends half its people, every time a church holds actual real conversations that help us grow together, every time there's a political issue that just butts up against a religious value, politics affects religion. Why? Because politics has a claim on our value system, and it says something about how we think people should live. And religion has a claim on our value system and says something about how we think people should live. It happened in the Civil War. What side is God on? What did Abraham Lincoln say? We want to be on God's side. It's not a matter of which side God's on. Happened in the Civil Rights Movement when churches, many of you remember this, churches were on both sides of this. It wasn't as though all the churches were on one side. And thank God that we had Martin Luther King to reach over the basic debates and draw us to the deeper issues. It's happening in the church today that just about any hot-button issue can turn so many people into a grudge match, yelling one side to the other. Or at least, even if we don't get to that point, the feeling around churches seems to be an attitude where they are always ready to fight for their understanding of God. Always ready to fight against each other. Always against maybe some secular threat. Always against anyone who disagrees. They can't be Christian if they believe that. You know how many times I've been told that? I can't take communion with them if they think that. They must be crazy to vote that way. I can't share coffee and fellowship with anyone like that. And that is going down a tough road. And so that oh-so-common debate attitude today is so different from what Paul told us to do. An attitude of defending the purity of one's faith at all cost is the attitude that Paul left when he began to follow the way of Jesus. And today, even the assumption that there are sides on which we belong, in the church, for the church, the presumption of sides is one of the main things that is disabling Christianity around the whole country. It's keeping people away from church. When you ask people their best description of church, of who are Christians, the first word is judgmental, and the second word is that they fight over politics too much. I think we can do a better job of that. How do we do a better job of that? J. Herbert Nelson is the director of the Presbyterian Washington office. Did you know we had a lobbying arm of our church? Presbyterians, because they've always been a little more educated than other religious traditions, they have been overrepresented in Congress for as long as there's been a Congress. Presbyterians have never had more than 2% of the U.S. population. We're currently down to like 0.6%. We've never had less than 7% of Congress. Kind of neat. So we should have someone there being able to be a minister to the Congress folks. He says, J. Herbert Nelson says, enough of this, we can't talk about politics in church. I am convinced that church is the first place to talk about politics because we ought to be able to talk about anything in church and still love one another. Perhaps the best preparation for spiritual people to be spiritual amidst the controversies of our day is to actually talk about them. Don't hide the elephant in the room like we do at Thanksgiving dinner so you can have a pleasant 2-hour conversation before everyone splits from kitchen to Cowboys game. This is the place to talk about the way that you think the world should be as people of faith. This is the place to talk to each other, trusting that we are not on a road to fighting, knowing that we are committed together. This is the place to ask each other, why do you believe that? And be prepared to answer, not with sound bites that you've heard on the news, but for why you think God wants the world that way. How to be better with controversy. Step 2. We can look at Jesus. Jesus was absolutely political. At least he was constantly thrown into political questions of his day, and he always engaged in those, not by picking one side or the other, but by hovering above the simple conceptions of what the debates were about. He didn't let the media of that time or the sides of that time determine the issue. He looked deeper into people's hearts, and he determined the issue. When we talk about harsh topics in the church, we are called to dig deeper with each other. And step 3 from Martin Luther King weekend, that pastor said, we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters or perish together as fools. Paul admits that disagreements and controversies will not always work. We will not always find an easy path through it. But he does seem committed over and over to helping us through our troubles as brothers and sisters. And if we hold on to that value first, the idea that we are in it together, then if we know that value before we ever name our differences, we're so much less likely to treat each other as enemies. So guns and gays and abortion and climate change and immigration and healthcare and taxes. We could take this time and move our pews right back to our normal places. It'd be a nice sign. Or we can keep them this way a little bit longer, forced to look at each other. Someone said that. Brother and sister, building relationships that are strong enough to withstand the winds of political discourse, strong enough to seek a deeper peace. And that is my hope, and that's my challenge to you, to embody the path of harmony even through the storm. Amen.